Rocky, Star Wars, Halloween, Mad Max, Indiana Jones, Blade Runner, Terminator, Ghostbusters, Top Gun, Bill and Ted, Jurassic Park, Jumanji, Space Jam, Scream, Men in Black, and The Matrix. These are all movie franchises that started in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that have also gotten a sequel in the last 10 years. These are called legacy sequels. After decades of not seeing these worlds and characters, they were brought back to theaters in the 2010s and 2020s. Some of these tell worthwhile stories, and some of them are just there to make a quick buck preying on nostalgia. Some of these films are great, and some of them are pretty bad. Because of the release of the 5th Indiana Jones film, in this video I'm going to go over the best and the worst of legacy sequels. So starting off in the 2000s, we got two notable legacy sequels that came decades after their last sequel in their franchise: Rocky Balboa and Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Rocky Balboa works as its own movie, and it's a good story of Rocky going into the ring one last time. Yes, it is absolutely relying a bit on past memories of the original Rocky film, and to be honest, it's one of the first films to ever do that. It is very much living in the past. To me though, it's a necessary ending to that series, while also existing mostly to look back fondly on the original. But it's also not the very end of this franchise, so let's shelve that one for now. I have some controversial things to say on Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It's a good movie. Not only is it just as exciting as the original film, in my opinion, it also brings the franchise into the future and does something new. While I do prefer the biblical artifact stories in Raiders and Last Crusade, I think it was fine to do something completely different with this character, and the alien story actually works for me for the most part. I don't fully buy into that ending where too much of the mystery is shown right to our faces, but I truly can't understand most of the hate this film gets. It didn't go too far into lazy nostalgia because it actually had a new story to tell, and I think because it was too different from the classics, fans got way too upset, and it taught Hollywood the wrong lessons about bringing old franchises back. Both Rocky and Indiana Jones have even more sequels after these ones, so let's move on to the 2010s. 2015 was a huge year for legacy sequels. We got another Rocky film, Creed, we got Star Wars back with The Force Awakens, we got Jurassic World, and we got Mad Max Fury Road. Fury Road is a great action film that brings this dystopian world to life way more than that lame original film ever did. The sequel is leaps and bounds ahead of that first film, and it actually uses that potential to make something out of nothing. That's a great sequel in my eyes. Creed is also an example of a great legacy sequel, and it's more than that. The Rocky franchise did this perfectly. They had the epilogue sequel in Rocky Balboa, and then they had the reboot sequel in Creed so that the franchise can keep going with a new lead. They didn't milk it when there was nothing left. They actually came up with a new way to have it continue with a new set of films inside of that larger series. It's a flawless transition from Rocky to Adonis Creed, where it wins over Rocky fans and also manages to be its own thing for the modern era. Jurassic World, on the other hand, is pretty meh. It's kind of fun and it's not too connected to the Jurassic Park films yet, but we'll talk about that later when we get to Dominion. This franchise actually tried to do what Rocky did, but it didn't work this time. It's a new series inside of the Jurassic title, but instead of the clean transition between eras, we're introduced to new characters now, and the old characters come back in the threequel. It's very messy, but this first one was alright, I guess. Then we have The Force Awakens and the Star Wars sequel trilogy. I think everyone knows now that these films are terrible. It's probably the worst and most disjointed trilogy of all time. The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker are two of my least favorite movies ever made, blah blah. But how does The Force Awakens perform as a sequel on its own? I think it's okay. The whole story is a recap of A New Hope, and a lot of it is meant to remind you of your nostalgia. Each character echoes the ones from the originals a little too much, and every time there's a returning object or character, it's obvious what they're going for. The way it reveals the return of Han Solo and Chewbacca is the first of its kind. It is the first film to be self-conscious of fan reactions, and it is practically begging you to cheer. This has become a staple of these legacy sequels. Old characters come back, and it is supposed to be the most epic thing you've ever seen on its own. And yeah, it works sometimes. Seeing this film opening night will always be an incredible experience, because that excitement from real Star Wars fans was so nice to be a part of. The Force Awakens was a return to this world, and that was enough for a lot of people at the time. Looking back, it's not trying all that hard to be new or creative, but it got the job done and made people excited for Star Wars to be back, at least for a time. Next, we come to two of the best ones, for different reasons. First, Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle. It's interesting that they ever went back to this franchise, but I'm glad they did, because this reboot is so fun and creative. It has ties to the original concept, but it also brings it into the 21st century, with it being a video game instead of a board game. This is a legacy sequel that really works as its own thing. It doesn't require you to be a fan of the 90s film to enjoy it. The sequel to the reboot sequel, The Next Level, is the one that's kinda useless, but it's still fun. The cast of these movies really make it great, and this is a legacy sequel that is just as good as the old film by being very different from it. Then we have Blade Runner 2049. I think most people who have seen both Blade Runner movies can agree that this is the way to do it. Denis Villeneuve recaptured the personality and style of that classic film 35 years later. It has all the themes and ideas that made that original movie good, but expands on them so much more. The concept of the replicants was the best part of the original, and the sequel takes that concept and runs with it to craft an even more engaging story and human conflict. The sequel has a new main character played by Ryan Gosling, and it also brings Harrison Ford's character back, which is very cool, but that wasn't the driving force for the movie, which is good. Blade Runner 2049 wasn't made because old Blade Runner fans would rush out to have their nostalgia fed after all these years. It was made because there was more potential in that universe for good stories, and they made something special. It's a proper sequel to the original that just happens to have been made decades later. So much thought, time, and effort was put into it to make that world come back to life perfectly, and you can feel that. That's why Denis Villeneuve is the best. He gave 110% to this legacy sequel, and it's the best one so far. Now let's talk about some of the most pointless ones of all. Men in Black International is such a hilariously bad cash grab that nobody even cares about. They got Thor and Valkyrie to be the new leads, when the only appeal of the first few was Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. There's no reason to keep the Men in Black franchise alive. Then there's the recent Terminator sequels. Genesis from 2015 is absolutely horrendous, it's truly embarrassing. And there's also Dark Fate from 2019, which I didn't think was terrible. Having the Sarah Connor character back was cool, and I like that it erased Terminator 3 through 5 from canon, but it's also so obvious that they were trying to recapture the magic by telling the exact same story in a different way. But a better thing to do is leave the franchise alone for good. The first two Terminator films are great, and we don't need any more. Bill and Ted 3 is also a thing that happened at some point. For how goofy that franchise always was, I actually think this was on par with the first two. It's extremely forgettable, but at least it's a trilogy now, and these characters got a decent ending. Keanu Reeves also had another legacy sequel in the Matrix franchise. The Matrix Resurrections is awful, I have to say. Like Dark Fate, it's telling the exact same story as the original, but worse. A lot of these films leave you questioning what was the point of that, but with Matrix 4 you have to ask that question every few minutes. We just need to forget about this franchise outside of the original, because not only does this sequel defeat its own purpose, it gives the original less meaning when the character keeps going in a cycle of being in the Matrix and escaping it over and over. It's so utterly pointless. 2021 also brought us Ghostbusters Afterlife. Thinking on it now, it's not very good and it probably shouldn't have been made, but I sure did enjoy it when I saw it. It's a funny movie and I like all the new characters, but why does it have to be tied to an old brand that should be long dead? The answer is, of course, because it wouldn't have made money any other way. Yes, if this wasn't a Ghostbusters movie, I wouldn't have seen it, and that's the problem. But it's not like it really holds any value on its own. The old cast of the Ghostbusters appearing at the end was pretty dumb, and it's not a reboot that can really continue in a good way, but sure, it was fun. By the way, the other franchises I mentioned at the beginning, Halloween, Scream, and Space Jam, I have not seen any films from them. I do have to catch up on some horror films, and I'm not planning on watching Space Jam 1 or 2. Now let's catch up to the modern times. Last year we got Top Gun Maverick and Jurassic World Dominion, which couldn't be more different in their approach. These two films perfectly show the best and the worst of legacy sequels. On one hand, Dominion, the epic conclusion to the Jurassic saga as it claims to be. It's the mega culmination of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. It's got all the characters you love from both series combining, and yet it's the most boring movie ever made. It handled the classic characters so poorly and gave them so little to do that nobody even cares that Ian Malcolm or Alan or Ellie are back. This film relies on the rest of the franchise for you to care, but then it gives nothing beyond the initial thrill of seeing the actors back. Nobody cares because they did nothing in this film. On the other hand, Top Gun Maverick is a great movie in its own right. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people say that they didn't care for the first movie, but still loved Maverick. Same goes for me. Top Gun is such an 80s film, and when I saw it, I really didn't care for it. Maybe it deserves a rewatch, but the point is, I didn't have to like it to get really into this sequel. Maverick builds on the original and does everything better. The action capabilities are obviously far better today than back then, and they really went all out to make some of the best modern air action we've ever seen. This sequel also goes so much further into great character development, with the main character Pete Mitchell, as well as Rooster earning each other's respect. This film gave hope to modern sequels and showed everyone else how to do it right. I remember first hearing that there would be a modern Top Gun sequel coming out, and I thought it would be just another pointless cash grab, but it turned out to be one of the best stories of last year and an entertaining ride that the world needed. It's simply a great film that's also a legacy sequel. And finally, let's talk about the new release, Indiana Jones 5. This was a disappointment, but not because it's so embarrassingly bad, it's because it's just so lifeless. Indiana Jones is supposed to be the most exciting, flashy adventure franchise of all time, and those classic films work even without a lot of deep emotions or character arcs. This new film can't give that excitement, because Harrison Ford is 80 now, and a few times they mention the obvious, that he can't do it like he used to. The movie is horribly boring and uninteresting for nearly 2 hours because it's a story about an 80-year-old Indy, but it also refuses to explore any of his character development or how his life has changed throughout these films. The story is following the same beats that it's supposed to, with different pieces of the dial and instructions to find pieces being collected along the way, which is the excruciating slow plot we get for most of this, and even the action is unexciting. The difference that this movie has to the previous ones is that it needs something like character work or interesting themes to fill the Spielberg-sized gap, but it doesn't even do that. It's not an exciting adventure film, and it's also not an emotional final chapter for this character, so what really is it? It's a very nothing movie. I did like the ending when the dial is actually used, even with how wacky that was, without getting into spoilers, and I like the conversations Indy had about his past, but we needed so much more. To me, Crystal Skull 15 years ago did way more justice to a story about an old man Indiana Jones moving on from his old life and starting a new one, therefore giving that one more of a purpose as a legacy sequel. Maybe the fact that I like that movie makes me feel like this one was pointless even more. Either way, it's a dull movie that does not deserve the title Indiana Jones. Now that we've gone through the timeline, let's go through the top 3 best and worst legacy sequels for me. So my top 3 favorite legacy sequels, at number 3 is Creed. It works as an addition to the old series and also starts a new one. Number 2 is Top Gun Maverick. It brings a cheesy 80s movie into a modern style and does everything the first one did better. And number 1 is Blade Runner 2049. It stays loyal to the original and pushes the world and concepts further than ever before. Now my top 3 worst legacy sequels. At number 3 is Matrix Resurrections, which tells the exact same story as the original, but duller, and takes away meaning from the original. Number 2, Jurassic World Dominion. It tries to be an epic culmination, but doesn't honor the old films or characters, and leaves nothing to care about. And number 1, the worst legacy sequel is The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker together. I skipped talking about them in this video, but here's my overall thoughts. These films tear apart the old stories, make you hate your old favorite heroes, yet can't stop living in the past by copying them and bringing every old character back. These two movies also seem to be against each other, making for the perfect example for awful legacy sequels. In conclusion, there's no clear rise and fall for legacy sequels. There's a lot of annoying, pointless ones, but there's also some Blade Runner 2049s and Top Gun Mavericks that come around once in a while, and you can't really tell what kind of legacy sequel it's going to be until it's out. I'm sure there'll still be plenty of Dial of Destiny type films to come. Hopefully we'll have some more Top Gun Maverick type films as well. Legacy sequels definitely aren't dying anytime soon. So what is your favorite film that we talked about today? Comment down below. That's about it for this video. See you in the next one. Toy Story 2, 1999. Toy Story 3, 2010. Does this count? Is Toy Story a legacy sequel?